Hi, and welcome to Tech Talk. I'm Ken Mingus, Executive Editor at Computer World. I'm here with CSO's Michael Nadeau, CSO's Steve Reagan from an undisclosed location, and Mark Lewis here from IDG, I guess we'd say. Today's topic, GDPR. We're going to figure out why you keep getting those emails that tell you that companies' personal privacy, regulations, data, things, whatever. We're going to tell you what's going on. Michael, GDPR. I know that anybody that's sort of looking at this probably has a basic understanding and why the companies are sending all these notices out, but maybe just the most basics of where we are right now and how we got here.
Right. Well, the EU's General Data Protection Act goes into effect a little more than a week from today on the 25th, and it's basically to protect the privacy rights of EU residents or citizens. It's not exactly clear.
Okay.
So basically, it puts an onus on anybody handling EU resident data to protect that. And if they don't protect it, if they don't make good faith efforts to protect it, then they could face significant fines. So there's been a lot of discussion about the readiness of companies, especially in the U.S., about this, and honestly, most companies are not going to be 100% compliant by deadline. That's probably okay, as long as they're making a good faith effort. Where companies, the things that if you haven't done by now would be like if you don't have a handle on all the data that you need to protect, where it is, and have a plan in place for protecting it, then you're probably at risk.
Okay. One of the things that I've wondered about this was there something specific that prompted the EU to act? I mean, obviously there are data breaches every year. The big Equifax breach last year, and obviously because it's EU and so many U.S. companies have business in Europe, it basically affects companies globally.
Right.
But was there anything that triggered this, or is it something that's been sort of bubbling up for the last few years?
I don't think there's any single event that triggered this. This has been they've been working on this for a number of years now, and it updates an earlier privacy regulation. I think it was just a response to the growth of social media, the fact of these large digital companies like Amazon and Apple having a lot of data on people.
Right.
I think they just felt like they needed to update the existing regulation.
Okay, and so when they did that, that's what's prompted companies finally to get serious about how. I mean, I understand that what's at stake here is how a company handles that data, whether it's protected, whether it's walled off, whether a company takes the kinds of actions they should take to protect it, to guard against breaches and things like that. And do we have a sense whether companies have been sort of dragging their feet and are now really rushing to try to make this deadline? Or is it the sort of thing where this is kind of like almost like a soft launch, that the May 25th is when it goes into effect, but it's probably going to be a period of weeks or months before it's really enforced?
Well, I think in the U.S. anyway, companies have it's only been in the last 8 months or so that companies have really started to take it seriously. They've done their assessments. I think most companies have done their assessments. They understand what they need to do. They're just not very far along, and not as far along as they could be to complete that process. Kinds of things that have been put off that aren't finished are things like third-party contracts. A lot of the data. Very few companies hold all the data in-house.
I see. Yeah, right. It goes out.
So if you have Salesforce, for example, you've got a lot of customer data in Salesforce. Well, that's that data is stored at Salesforce, or you have something in the Amazon cloud. So that means that companies now are looking at all those contracts, going to the third-party providers and saying, how are you being GDPR compliant? Are you going to be? What's our risk because of our relationship with you? And then agreements are being updated to account for those for what to make sure that all parties have the same understanding as to how they're becoming GDPR compliant.
Yeah, it's interesting that as you think about how this is rolling out, it shows how so much of this data moves from company to company. And, while I guess the originating company that collected the data may be ultimately responsible for it, it doesn't always hang on to it. And so therefore, each company has to reach out to everybody that it does business with to make sure that that data is as protected elsewhere as it is in-house. Mark, I wanted to turn to you for a minute. You are Vice President of Audience Development here at IDG, and you've been dealing with the whole idea of what a U.S. company, what our company has to do to protect data, to make sure that we're compliant or moving toward compliance. And I just wanted to find out, how that's going. And also, I'm sure it's going fine. We're going to be compliant. No, but I mean, the kinds of things you've come across, because I have a feeling other companies will be dealing, with similar issues, even if they're not exactly the same. So where do things stand, as we're getting close to this deadline?
Yeah, Ken, it's been about a year-long process here, and it started way at the top level. So we have a bunch of different business units that are not only here in the U.S., but around the world. So we've been really aware of this regulation coming down and made a lot of different plans. I think what Michael hit on was the first thing we needed to do about a year ago was just take a full audit of all of our systems and all the data and where's it going, it's going here, it's going there, it's going to this third party, it's going into an internal system here. What systems are connected, what systems are not connected. And then what we really needed to do is create just a map of all the data that we have and all the systems that we have so that we could start thinking about how to architect in the different levers that we're going to need to make our systems and our data GDPR compliant. So, it very simply starts with finding out everything that you have. And that was no easy task because we have so many different business units around the world and how are they all sort of commingling data together. We looked at that and we realized that we had to rebuild a lot of our systems. So we've spent the past year rebuilding a bunch of systems to understand, where data is going, to pull it all into one giant sort of data lake, and that gave us the ability to start putting in the controls for the authentication and the access and the consent that we need to make ourselves GDPR compliant. So we feel we're in a good position. We're pretty far down the road as far as being live by next Friday, which will be the 25th. Whenever you're watching this, I don't know if it'll be before or after, but there are definitely things when through the first point that you hit the sites, our websites, through when you register for either editorial content that is the insider program that may have registration based, or our commercial content where you might download a white paper and you need to give over some personal data. What happens when that person hits submit on that registration form? What is the flow? Where does that go? How are we protecting that? How are we dealing with that? How are we cataloging that and capturing that so that we can deal with it on the other end, where if somebody wants to be forgotten, or if somebody needs their audit log, or if we just want to be able to protect that data and understand where it is, we need to put those controls in place. So the past year has really been spent really overhauling our systems. And what I will say, though, is it has been a top-down approach, and it has permeated the entire organization. So it's not just the customer-facing websites or our commercial programs, but you also have to think about what HR has to do to protect data, because we have employees here that are in the EU, or and they have rights on their data as to what we can hold. And then we have a whole business units in the EU that have much stricter regulations than we have here. So there's a lot of moving parts, and a lot of different business units are being affected by this, but it's been an interesting year, I'd say.
I bet. One of the things I wanted to ask about is sort of the structure of how this compliance at IDG is working, because I know one of the things that the regulation says is that the people who are sort of touching the data and collecting the data shouldn't be the same people who are overseeing how it's protected and kept. I mean, and so what are we doing to make sure that part of it is, that we're complying with that?
So the first thing we did was we appointed a DPO. We appointed a data privacy
protection
officer.
Data pricy officer. Got it. Okay.
I think they were probably interchangeable.
DPO, yeah.
And this may fall to any number of people in the organization. It could be, a CIO, but the data protection officer that we appointed actually was more in the finance realm than somebody who, like me, is dealing with data and dealing with email and sort of understanding segments and how to market to people. And what we've done is we've taken an approach. Each country now has a liaison that is kind of appointed as the DPO for that particular country.
Okay.
So it will roll up into that singular person, but we need to have local expertise and local controls and a centralized location where all the information about GDPR and the rules and the regulations is all captured in one place. So the local person in the U.S. is going to be capturing all the information about every single entity of the business unit, wherever information is stored, wherever information is kept, and then they are going to be able to understand, all right, well, what happens if a regulator or auditor comes in? They're going to be the person to go talk to about legitimate interest or some of these other ideas about GDPR that are really are tenets of the GDPR rules. So that's how we've structured it. But really every part of the organization is getting involved. So the engineering team, the product teams, HR, as I mentioned, executive, and even people that are just rank and file really have to know about what their rights are as far as their data, and understand. We're publishers, so we have we have a skin in the game that's maybe greater than some other types of organizations. Mm-hmm. That we capture data and we market to you, and that's one of the things that we're trying to protect. Right, is that people need to have control of their data, and they need to have control of where that data is going and who it's going to, and they need to understand that. So, ultimately, I think GDPR is going to be good, and I think it's going to be good because it legitimizes what we're doing, and we're really trying to show people, hey, this is what we're doing with your data. This is how we're doing it. This is who it's going to. I think in the past we, not only us, but I think a lot of publishers have been more opaque about, hey, we're just going to take your registration and we're going to go do something with it. But we're not able to do that anymore. We have to really showcase where we're sending your data and who we're sending it to. And it has to be a legitimate interest of why we're holding onto your data before we purge it or before we have controls of, hey, this person hasn't engaged with us. We need to get rid of them. We can't just hold on to them anymore. So
yeah, it does seem like, one of the things that I've noticed is that this whole idea of it gives companies, if they want to, a way to lean into this and offer up this kind of transparency. I mean, it's being forced on them by the GDPR rule that's coming out of the EU, but companies can also take that and use it to their advantage to say, here's what we're doing, and here's why, and almost sort of make sure that users or any customers understand what's happening to the information about them.
Yeah, that's the approach we're taking. We want to be transparent about what you're signing up for. One of the rules of GDPR is it has to be as easy to get in, and it has to be as easy to get out as it is to get in, pardon me. And we really want to make that apparent. I know, at least here in the past, there's been some hoops to jump through to either to get out of email. We can't have that anymore. Everything needs to be cleaned up, and that was a lot of the year was spending. Hey, let's clean up our systems, let's clean up our processes, let's clean up our data management profiles and products, and really just make sure that it's very simple and very clear to the user what they're signing up for, and then where their data is going, and then how we hold that data. And if they want to get out, if they want to unsubscribe, or they want us to erase their data, or they want to understand it in a deeper log how that data is being moved and shared, we're now able to do that.
Were you going to say something, Michael? Did I hear you?
No.
Okay. I was going to ask one of the questions of Mr. Reagan from our undisclosed location. So, I mean,
hi,
how are you, buddy? So obviously with something like this, there are a lot of both privacy and security issues that arise. And, I wonder if it's forcing companies to deal with issues that they may have let lie fallow for a long time. Not us, of course, but other companies. From the security perspective, Steve, what are you seeing in terms of what companies are having to do, and do you think companies are actually getting a handle on where all this data is and how they can protect it?
Well, before we address that,
okay.
I want to point out something. In the explanation he just gave and the steps IDG has been taken to get ready for May 25th, I want everybody to recognize how much of a massive undertaking that is. And we're not a large enterprise like some of the other countries or companies around the country right now. But look at all the effort that went into it, and then honestly ask yourself, are you really going to be fully compliant by the 25th? Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. And that relates to your question, which is a lot of companies are finding out that they don't know where all their data is. They don't know who has control to what. Some of them are just now discovering that they have third-party feeds and contracts with vendors that are relevant to this regulation, yet they didn't account for it when they started doing budgeting or assigning tasks or getting the teams, various teams within the units, out working on this massive project. And it's really starting to trip them up. I spoke to a company the other day who was actually panicked over the fact that they had completely forgotten that when they have their support users on a CMS log in and create an account, well, all of the data in that account, that's covered. Yet they didn't consider it because it's a third party that was running that for them, but yet it's their product, so technically they do have to be aware of it, and there's steps they need to take here. So they're kind of panicked and they're rushing to catch up with that, but that's just one minor thing compared to other companies that I talked to when I was in California earlier this year who hadn't even gotten started until like the middle of April. They're just now starting. There is absolutely no way they're going to get a grip on this before May 25th. None. But their saving grace, like Michael was saying earlier, is the fact that if they're showing good faith effort, there's a good chance they're probably not going to get hit with fines or anything. But the biggest problem is a lot of people just don't know where their data is and who's got it. That's going to be a huge, huge roadblock coming up in the next, I'm going to argue the next 2 or 3 months. That's where you're going to see a lot of the problems. People are going to start discovering data they didn't know was there, and that's going to be a big headache for them.
Yeah, I'm sure that, over the last 5, 10, 15 years, as companies have grown and data collection has grown in different ways that data can leak out, that many companies, most companies probably don't know where all their data is. In terms of the GDPR, does this allow regulators to come in and do an audit before there's an issue, or are we basically waiting until there's a breach and then they come in after the fact and say, here's where you screwed up, or here's what you didn't do, or you didn't do anything, and so we're going to hit you with some fines. I mean, they're not being proactive in the EU, right? I mean, they're putting the regulation in and then waiting until something happens. Is that how it works?
Well, kind of. See, what'll happen is if there's a breach or any kind of problem, and this is in the EU or the US,
right,
you most definitely will get audited. And that audit will find all of your pain, and you're going to pay for that. Every ounce of inadvertent negligence or outright negligence on your part in the aftermath of a breach, an auditor is going to find that, and you're in trouble. But the thing is, like any other regulation, you're going to have regular audits on this stuff. You're going to have to show that you're still compliant. You're going to find auditors that are going to that'll pop up as part of their regularly scheduled program, to borrow a phrase. You're not going to just say you're compliant and then nobody's going to check on you. But most definitely there will be audits after a breach. But you're going to see stuff like that before. It's no different in this point than like say you're what is it?
Complying
PCI,
with like software licenses, maybe, or something like that. It's like
no, more like PCI auditing and other auditing audit trails like that. You'll get audited for stuff like this.
We're half expecting there to be sort of the ambulance chaser.
I was just going to say this is going to be a field day for lawyers, on both sides.
Not just lawyers, but consultants in general. Right now, I talked to one C-level in California who told me he'd been approached that week during RSA by no more than 4 different GDPR consultants who were quite happy to charge him about $50,000 a week just to come in and look at paperwork and write some policy for them. Not actually fixing anything, just telling you what you need to do and what you need to fix.
And those policies are probably a template too. They're
cookie cutter.
They just spread them around all the companies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, here's another thing that blew my mind is a lot of companies were going in and they're hiring lawyers to try to get themselves out of scope. Now, you and I talked about this last week, Ken.
Yep.
Well, it's still the same thing. And I talked to somebody just Monday, who was like, well, our lawyer is pretty confident that we're not going to be held accountable to a lot of the stuff. And the only thing I could think of was, all right, you say that now. Next month, when I'm writing a story about you, I'll ask you the same question and we'll see what you have to say then. But it was just, I can't stress enough that I think the biggest problem here is we're going to find companies that thought they could get away with meeting the bare minimum when if you do business in the EU, that's just not going to happen. The bare minimum over there is completely different than what we allow here. And a lawyer is not going to get you out of that. And a $50,000 a week consultant is not going to help you, because those cookie cutter policies, what worked for another company might not work for you, because you don't know where all your data is.
Yeah.
You're going to be boned from the beginning.
I would think it would almost be, impossible to have the same policies from company to company to company. I mean, even if it's in the same industry doing similar things, just the variety of ways that data is collected and distributed and how it's held and protected is going to vary so much that just there is no one standard set of policies that would work for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. So what happens if, okay, let's say it's 2 or 3 months down the road, I'm, DPO for a company that's been working on this for 6 months or maybe a year, trying to get all of these, rules and regulations complied with, and I have a breach, and, somebody from the EU comes in and finds that while I made a really good faith effort, I still didn't get there in time. Are we looking at immediate fines, do you think, Michael, or?
It's hard to say. Some of the EU regulators have made comments recently trying to, I think, put companies at ease over fines. Basically, they've said, if you've made a good faith effort, if you talk to us, if you collaborate with us, if there's a breach, and very important, if you report within the 72-hour window, that's a big deal for them.
So fast reporting is a major issue here.
Right, and you have to be able to document the process. And I think this is another area where companies are just kind of scrambling at the last minute to finish up that documentation in terms of what they've done for GDPR compliance. But having that and being able to show that will be very important. So the sense is that unless you've done something really, really bad, like sat on a breach for months, did not have safeguards in place, and were not compliant, then you're at risk for a significant fine.
Okay, and the fine is what, 4% of a company's revenues?
4% of revenue, or 20 million euros.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a substantial. They want to make sure that people are paying attention to this.
Yeah.
The companies are paying attention to this.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, Michael, I've got a question for you. With that 72-hour window, is that 72 hours from the time you detect it, or 72 hours from the time of the incident?
72 hours from the time that you detect it.
Which is a problem if you think about it, because most companies don't know they've been breached for weeks or months after the fact.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and when you detect it too, that's questionable. If you see an anomaly, it might be a breach, it might not. But what is the EU Commission going to consider detection? That's an unanswered question.
Yeah, I find it interesting too, and maybe I shouldn't, given the way things are going in Washington right now. But I mean, this kind of regulation, especially with all of the attention on privacy and, of course, data breaches that we're familiar with from recent years, you would think there would be something similar coming out of Washington that would be equal to this or try to do the same sort of thing. And yeah, I know it, Steve, and you're laughing hilariously. I know. I hope springs eternal, man. I'd like to think that somebody somewhere is in charge of things, but it's just interesting to me that it's the EU leading the way, and just because companies happen to be global, we're all rushing to comply. But
yeah, Ken, from our perspective, the couple things that we're finding are companies that are largely based in the U.S. are taking this very seriously. So the clients and the customers that we work with are requesting of us that we add additional language to registration forms, for example, even if they're only U.S. companies, that they want to have an extra layer of protection so that if something came out from another country, or they just want to have additional layers of consent on individuals that they want to market to. So they're taking it very seriously. And I've also heard that we're half expecting, or probably fully expecting, that Asia and even the U.S. will follow with something like this. And we know that we've been working through the CASL laws in Canada, and we're actually hopeful that some of these regulations that we put in place may help us with those laws in Canada, that they've been very stringent on the amount of emails and the type of emails and the consent on emails that we can send, that we may be able to open up some of those borders for us, at least north of the border, for marketing.
China's supposed to have a GDPR-like rule in place by October, I think. So that's a big market.
So basically, no matter where you are in the world right now, whether it's coming from the EU or eventually the U.S. perhaps, or China in the fall, companies are going to have to, get their hands around data that they've got and do everything they can to protect it. Do we really think that this is going to make a big difference, like when it comes to reducing the number of breaches, data breaches, and no?
No, not at all.
It's like the stair step, you take steps to protect data, and then the bad guys figure out some way around that, then you take more steps. And
yeah, it is. But I mean, the thing is, if you look at let's look at the last 5 years, the big data breaches that came out through that, these are not controls that GDPR would address. We're talking software vulnerabilities, we're talking configuration errors on a server, unauthenticated access because somebody lost their password or got compromised. I mean, there's a number of things that GDPR simply won't prevent. You can know where all your data is and who has access to it. You can strictly control what employees, can do what, when, and where on your network. But here's the thing. If I compromise one of your employees, or if I crack a shell on the back of one of your servers, I own you. It doesn't matter what your regulation is. The goal now is to detect me and then report this incident within 72 hours to keep your butt covered. Otherwise, it doesn't help you.
Okay, that makes sense. I do get the whole rapid reporting, because there's been so many times that there have been breaches, and then you find out about it months or even a year later, and you can tell that the company clearly. Benign neglect is about the best thing you could possibly come up with in terms of how a company dealt with some of these things. And sometimes it just seems like outright, let's not talk about it, let's hide it, let's pretend it, let's and move on, and then it comes out anyway. So one question I have, and let's say that I run a small company and I'm only now really dealing with this. I wouldn't even know where do you start to try to figure out what data, I mean, because if you look at the definition of the kind of information and data that this looks at, it's like anything almost that could identify you as a human being. It's very, very broad to my untrained eye. So if I'm a company trying to figure out what to do now, I mean, maybe I get one of those $50,000 a week consultants real quick so I can say I did something, but where do you start?
It's actually pretty basic. From my reading of the regulation and understanding is go with the gut assumption that if this piece of data could be used to identify a patient, a client, or a customer of your organization, it's covered, period. If I need that piece of data and like four or five other pieces of data before I can identify you, it's covered. All of that data is covered because you can't leave any link in that chain exposed. That's the big point they're trying to do with all of this data protection. So you would start by learning what types of data you possess, how that data relates to your organization and your customers or your patients or what have you. And then you branch out from there to where does this data live? Where do you get this data? Who accesses this data? How do they access that data? Why do they access that data? You flow through that chart to where essentially what you're going to do is you're going to make a threat model that is basically GDPR, and then you're going to make a threat map that assigns everything to that model so that you can keep track of what's going when and where. That's where I would go with that. And you can do this as a small company or even a big company. Problem is, the bigger you are, the harder it's going to be because you're dealing with so much more volume at that point. And that's where the real roadblock's coming from right now. It's not that companies don't know what they need to protect. They don't know where it is. They don't know how much they have. And that's going to be, that's going to be their big headache coming down the line.
Yeah, Steve, one thing I think we're really focused on here is the training of employees on this data that they may have access to that contains personal identifiable information. So I'd say, a year ago, people were kind of willy-nilly with sending out files that had this data, but we really had to lock that down. We really had to go through training steps on, from the bottom up. Everybody in the organization needs to understand that things that they send out to clients, to reps, to their friends, they may just inadvertently send a spreadsheet or something that may have data on it. That is a findable offense that we really need to get our handle on. And so we've actually implemented systems here that are cloud-based systems that we know have very stringent rules. And and I think Steve's going to say there's nothing that's going to be safe, 100% foolproof, but we're going through the steps of taking this data and protecting it and moving it around in ways that we feel are the most secure. And, that's a big issue that we've had to overcome, is that, this data can come from anywhere in the organization and it can be sent to anybody. And how do we lock that down? How do we make that secure?
Yeah, it definitely feels like a very leaky world. I mean, I do get, though, the good faith effort part that, given how pervasive data is, how many places it's collected, how it's distributed either, inside a company or externally to other companies, or how it's spread, it's going to be impossible to lock down every bit of data for everyone all the time, But that said, this regulation is forcing companies to do everything they possibly can to make, a seriously good faith effort to lock it down as best they can. And they may still get fined. They probably will be breached, but they've done what they can. Do we have, any sense as to, let's say it's 6 months down the road, any guesses as to what percentage of companies will be compliant then? I know you say we should be in pretty good shape at IDG by the 25th.
Well, Steve says no one's going to be 100%, and
yeah.
I think we're going to be way far down the line. I hope we're way ahead of a lot of companies, because I've seen these systems work. We're rolling them out as we speak, and we feel pretty good about taking what the GDPR rules have in place and making them sort of executing on those to the clients and to how we're managing data. So it's very tricky. There's a lot of moving parts, and we have an organization that's a matrix organization that has a lot of different business units in a lot of different places in the world. So getting our hands around this, it's tough. And to be frank, we'll probably miss something somewhere, but the faster we can patch it up, the better we are.
Yeah, there is no endpoint for this, for anybody. There's always going to be new interpretations by the EU of the regulation that's going to cause people to rethink what they're doing. Companies are going to install new systems that are going to create new compliance issues that they didn't expect, so they're always going to be dealing with that. There's always going to be something. So this is going to be an ongoing effort. It's not going to be at some point you're going to be done.
Which reinforces the point that when it comes to the processes you have in place, because things will change, companies will grow, technology will evolve and morph. You've got to have the basic processes in place on data and how it's protected, so that you can apply that to whatever comes down the road. But that's a really good point, that this is just the start of everything, and there is no end point. It doesn't ever officially end.
Yeah. To that point too. Oh, sorry, Steve. I just say that
go ahead.
The ambiguity of the law, just the.
Do you think that's intentional? Maybe to leave it as broad as possible.
So,
yeah.
Yes.
That's what worries us.
It very much is.
Yeah,
So what's going to happen, Ken, is you wait. There's a really popular saying in security right now, and it's that no company who has experienced a data card breach has been PCI compliant at the time of the breach. Okay?
Yeah.
Now you wait. When we have a major data breach, you're going to hear that company was not compliant with GDPR at the time of the breach. You're going to hear this. It's going to come up because any simple little change will cause you to fall out of compliance if you're not paying attention. And by that, I mean, let's say you start working with a new vendor and they send you some information, and this information doesn't align with the records and data you've already got. It's new stuff you're ingesting, right?
Yep.
Well, if you don't take that into account with your existing model, guess what? You're not compliant, because that tracking invoice for this particular customer from that vendor just became an asset that you need to protect. But it's a new vendor. It's a new company. This is a new customer. This was not in our plan originally. But if you don't stay on top of that stuff, the more of that you collect, those new feeds, that's it. You're done.
So are companies fighting a losing game here? I mean, is it impossible for a company to ever be fully compliant forever? It's worth we're going to argue it's worth doing or worth trying, right?
It's worth trying, it's worth doing, but the thing is, it's not necessarily a losing battle. It's just a never-ending battle.
Yeah.
If you base your entire security model around a piece of paper or policy or a regulatory measure, you failed. You're done, because regulatory requirements are one type of level. You have to do a lot of stuff to keep security going in your organization, and just following a checkbox or a checklist and hoping an auditor passes you on Tuesday, that's not security. That's merely keeping the baseline minimum just to operate and do business. That's not protecting anything.
Yeah, it's almost sounds like CYA, just covering your ass at the moment to do what you're supposed to do. Okay. We've gotten a lot of good information here. Final thoughts? Anything that we should cover about GDPR that we haven't hit on yet that stands out for you guys?
Stop hiring lawyers to fix this regulation policy for you.
Okay.
And document everything.
Yeah,
if you can
good point.
show you've done a good faith effort, that's going to help you,
Yeah.
not hurt you.
My big concern is there's a looming cookie law that we'll get into more cookie policy, and that sort of dovetails a little bit into GDPR. But there's something on the horizon that I guess I'm always worried about something on the horizon. But there's more stringent cookie laws that I think the EU is working on now, and the cookie-based information that we capture, that's definitely part of this. But I think there's some other rules that are going to be.
I can see how that
tightening
might be
up a little
a
bit.
cause for concern
Yeah.
for the company. Michael, any other thoughts?
I'd just like to repeat that companies should not panic if they're making a good effort, and as they go through to maintain compliance, to reach compliance, always think about where's the business benefit in what they're doing, not just in terms of how can I be GDPR compliant, like IDG, for example. We're pulling all these systems together. I'm sure we're going to run a lot more efficiently because of it.
That's the
Excellent
hope.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. All right. So the brave new GDPR world starts on May 25th. It doesn't end anytime after that, ever, for anyone. I think at least I have a much better idea for how this is going to work. Steve, Mark, Mike, thank you. Thanks for being here. For now, you know what we know on GDPR.